friends and comrades, and welcome back indeed to another video on the MCP channel. Now I'm glad that our conservative communism video was received on the whole well by everyone apart from the infamous so-called Wang Ming. Now this individual, who goes by this curious name, made a couple of points, so I thought it would do well to go through them today on a video so that you can all benefit from the response too. So his first point concerned a worry about adopting populist conservatism, meaning a loss of support from what he calls the LGBT comrades. Now, I do think that this is likely. However, the amount of people that we would potentially isolate by endorsing conservatism would be like, in a given population, like 5% at the most, compared to those that we would gain, which could be like 60% or something, because guess what? The working class are conservative, and the people we're going to offend are probably just going to be, over-socialised graduate students who are in the minority and do not make up the base of a revolution. So if they're going to help us, they can help us, but if we're going to lose them, I'm not shedding tears over it. So, yes, so is it true that the isolation of the LGBT comrades will be the downfall of the revolution? Well, no, quite the contrary. The endorsement of them, actually, especially a very public endorsement, could serve the opposite. It could actually isolate the revolution from the masses, and indeed many of the masses are isolated from potentially revolutionary organisations, because all they ever do is bang out on about patriarchy and intersectional privilege and wave rainbow flags, and they don't want themselves or their families to be involved with any of that. Then it also seems like Wang misunderstood what we meant by to be a conservative, you must be a communist. He thought it meant something like everyone who calls themselves a conservative is automatically a communist, which is not our claim at all. We are not saying that everyone who's called themselves a conservative actually is a communist, but we're saying that those things that they claim to care about, or generally do care about, if they really want to conserve them, then the only way to do it is to be a communist. Capitalism isn't going to conserve them. That's the point. So yeah, these people might not be communists yet, but if they really do care about those things they talk about so much, we say that communism is the only way to conserve them. So that's the point there. So now let's talk about Stalin's conservatism in particular. There is a lot of evidence he was for Christian conservatism, contrary to what Wang said. He called Russia a defender of Christian civilization. Now, this is a Maoist organisation, as you know, and China didn't have the same background religiously, but was also very socially conservative. But besides, the focus of this video today is supposed to be on the Soviet Union. So let's proceed with that now, and perhaps I could make a video about Mao's conservatism sometime in the future as well. So yes, it is true that in the early days of the Soviet Union, when the over-socialised, urbanised intellectual revolutionaries were in charge, it was what we could consider pretty socially liberal for its time. Indeed, in 1920, the Soviet Union had legalised abortion on demand for free in all circumstances, and all laws from the Tsar, including those criminalising sodomy, were thrown out, even if no positive law was made to legalise it, and if gay marriage still wasn't accepted. And they still permitted discrimination based on homosexual behaviour and such, but there was no positive law to criminalise it anymore. Then, by 1924, things began to change a bit. Abortion was restricted to the mother's life only, and by 1936, when Stalin was solidly in power, it was totally outlawed. This, of course, was accompanied by much other pro-natalist and family-supporting legislation under the rather lengthy name of Decree on the Prohibition of Abortions, the Improvement of Material Aid to Women in Childbirth, the Establishment of State Assistance to Parents of Large Families, and the Extension of Network of Lying-in Homes, Nursery Schools and Kindergartens, the tightening up of criminal punishment for the non-payment of alimony, and on certain modifications in divorce legislation. Rather lengthy, but what it meant is, alongside criminalising abortion, each mother received 2,000 rubles per year per child up to age 5. Now, the funds originally covered the 7th and subsequent child, but in 1944 were expanded to kick in after the 3rd child, and especially provided extra support for single mothers whose husbands had unfortunately sacrificed their lives in the Great Patriotic War. Now, after Stalin died in 1953, though, the Khrushchevite government revoked the 1936 and subsequent laws and reinstated the 1920 laws. Surveys in Russia in the 1960s and 70s actually indicated that abortions outnumbered live births. Now, I've got to give credit where credit is due to Khrushchev. The Soviet Union still tried to discourage abortion in propaganda and such, but it was fruitless really, and after 1955 no attempt was ever made to try and pass laws to criminalise it ever again, as long as the Soviet Union lived. Now, as for contraception, it was legalised in 1923, and although Stalin didn't manage to instate an outright ban on it, he did manage to shut down a great many clinics, such that it would only have been possible to attain if it was especially requested from a gynecologist. He also ran additional propaganda campaigns against the harmful effects of birth control pills and IUDs. There was no promotion of contraceptives in schools, and Stalin also managed to get a ban on surgical contraceptive sterilisation pushed through in the 30s, which endured until 1990, but then all restrictions were removed on these kind of castrations, surgical castrations, in 1993. As for homosexuality, its explicit recriminalisation came under Stalin in 1933, and even after Stalin's death, homosexual acts were never legalised again in the whole of the Soviet Union's life. After its fall, they were legalised in 1993. Now, because Russia had Christian history as well, and an official state religion before, part of conservatism in the culture, it differed from China a bit. It did mean that there was religious conservatism too, and this came with a revival of the church. So, China was always it wasn't necessarily secular, as in there was no religion going on, but there was never an official religion, and there was also always a multiplicity of religions. Whereas Russia did have an association with one religion ingrained into the culture and heritage. So Stalin, as part of his Russian national conservatism, did give a special place to the Orthodox Church. And if we look at what Stalin did for the Orthodox Church, we can see his position was not one of militant atheism, like the intellectual Marxists of the early Soviet Union. Stalin re-established the Patriarchate. Of course, he demanded it to be loyal and supportive of the socialist state, but this is a huge leap forward in terms of religion in the Soviet Union. And to be honest, I don't think demanding their political loyalty would change the validity of any of their sacraments, their ordinations, their mass. Well, what they don't call them. They call it the Divine Liturgy. The Eucharist. All of that would have been valid. It's not like Stalin was changing the words of a missal. He was just demanding their political allegiance. It is undeniable that Stalin revived Russian tradition, and you do see many movies glorifying the Tsars. In fact, I showed that last time, being made at this time. He also halted all anti-religious propaganda. Bezboznik, Anti-Religosnik, and Atheist, which were major anti-religious journals, were all abolished. Anti-God magazines, plays, films, lectures, rallies were all cancelled. Even the former residence of a German ambassador was handed over to the Patriarch of Moscow. Of course, the Orthodox Church returned this favour with patriotic appeals, which helped to spur on the defence of Russia, the war efforts, and Stalin had seen that Russian national tradition, along with its traditional institutions, could bind the people in a cohesive defence. So you might say that his motive for being a conservative was rather shallow and was largely based around a war effort, but he did this nonetheless, and I do feel there was some genuine conviction in it as well. Of course, the Metropolitan condemned the invasion of the Germans for Stalin, and he compared them to earlier Western invaders in Russian history. But it wasn't only the Orthodox. Stalin did also try to improve relations with the Catholic Church too, and he actually wanted to attain support from them. However, And I had to actually criticise the Holy See here for being rather stubborn in their approach. The Holy See didn't really know that he had a change of heart, and he still saw him as a religious persecutor. And they actually refused to condemn Hitler's invasion of Russia at all. Furthermore, his revival of orthodoxy also it put strain on a closer relationship with the Catholic Church too. Unfortunately, his rapprochement with orthodoxy had regenerated some of the traditional Russian attitudes of animosity towards Catholicism. The living scar of that division, of course, was the Catholic Uniate Church. However, Stalin tried especially not to emphasize the difference between orthodoxy and Catholicism, as it had been in Russian history prior, although unfortunately he did try to assimilate the Uniate Church with the Orthodox Church, which is, I do criticise Stalin on that point, but I see he was a Russian nationalist above all, but that did have a role in alienating him from the Holy See even more. So, even though Stalin's position towards the Catholic Church had changed, and he had a more positive approach, his Russian traditionalist policy estranged him from the Vatican still. The Church seemed to have a lack of awareness of Stalin's changed attitude towards Catholicism though. In 1942 he had first permitted displaced Catholic Polish combat units to have Catholic chaplains. Later that year he appointed Joseph Gorlina, a Polish bishop, to organise the work of Catholic chaplains not only in Poland but throughout all of Russia. Nevertheless, his ties with Orthodoxy remained strong, and he still forbade the Polish priests in Russia from having contact with Orthodox Russian citizens. Nevertheless, in spring 1944, Stalin attempted to normalise relations with the Vatican. We can likely say this is because he saw that the Ukrainian Uniate Church could be an instrument of Ukrainian nationalism for the western part of the nation at least. He requested the Pope to work out a modus vivendi in Eastern Europe. Stalin had realised that the Catholic Church alone was the major lasting institution in war-torn Europe, so he sought to devise a livable living arrangement with it. To make his attitude known to the Church, he invited a Polish-American priest, Father Stanislaus Olomansky, to the Kremlin in late April 1944. During the two meetings that they had, Stalin explained that he had no animosity towards the Catholic Church, and that he was willing to negotiate an understanding. Olomansky promptly flew back to Chicago, and on the 12th of May told the world about Stalin's feelings towards the Catholic Church. He reported the two meetings lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes each, and he found Stalin to be, quote, very democratic and very open. He said, I told Stalin the most important problem to solve is the religious problem. He asked, do you think that cooperation with the Holy Father Pope Pius XII in the matter of struggle against coercion and persecution of the Catholic Church is possible? Then he said that Stalin replied, I think it is possible. Then Father asked Stalin, do you think it is admissible for the Soviet government to pursue a policy of persecution and coercion with regard to the Catholic Church? To which Stalin replied, as an advocate of freedom of conscience and of worship, I consider such a policy to be inadmissible and precluded. The rest of the meetings were apparently discussing policy, specifically on Poland, which Father Olomansky summarised as, Stalin gave me a promise that he will do all in his power to cooperate with the Church so that there will be no persecution. Following this, Pravda published statements by Father Olomansky stating that there was certainly a possibility of closer relations with the Vatican in combating the persecution of the Catholic Church. Then, Catholic children in Poland were permitted to have Roman Catholic religious education by clergy. In addition, Bibles and prayer books were printed at the government's expense, and Latin Rite churches were opened in western Ukraine. The Holy See, though, still didn't respond positively to this gesture because of the situation with the Catholic Uniate Church and Stalin's ever-continued favour of orthodoxy. Stalin wanted to work out an agreement with the Church in Eastern Europe, but he still expected the Vatican to accept the assimilation of the Uniate Church into the Orthodox Church. In January 1945, the newly elected Patriarch declared the Russian Unit Church was to voluntarily join the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1945 began the movement for the reunion of the Greek Catholic Church with the Orthodox Church, led by Gabriel Kostelnik. On the 9th of March, they were received into the All-Russian Orthodox Catholic Church by Patriarch Alexei. However, all the while, Stalin wrote to the Vatican to say that he desired a concordat in Eastern Europe. There, the Latin Rite of the Church was still the major operating institution, and he more or less needed it on his side. From 1945 onwards, in all satellite states, non-persecution policies came in. The Church, however, still was unresponsive to Stalin's benevolence, and said that any agreement made with Stalin could be interpreted as implicit approval to his assimilation of the Uniates, and also feared that a concordat would mean a loss of control directly from the Vatican to some extent. Maybe in a similar way to how the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association once operated out of step with the Holy See. In spring of 1948, Stalin made his last offer of a modus vivendi and said that otherwise he would take over the institutional structure of the church by force, as it had begun to spread Titoism outside of Yugoslavia. By mid-1949, the Unit Church was assimilated and Roman Catholic schools were nationalised. However, there was still no significant persecution as long as Stalin lived. Catholic associations formerly that had cooperated and collaborated openly with the Germans were dissolved, but the church wasn't persecuted at all. This was more or less the status quo until Stalin died. With the de-Stalinization policies under Khrushchev came much more intense persecution and again the return of anti-religious campaigns, which essentially continued throughout the rest of Soviet history. Even if his Russian nationalism caused him to err on the Unit issue, it overall can definitely be said to have great benefits for tradition in the Soviet Union, especially compared to the dire states it was in before and after Stalin. So Stalin was definitely a conservative, there's no doubt about that. But some people call Stalin's conservatism reactionary, and that would be quite foolish, because it is a type of conservatism fundamentally which is reconciled with modernity. A reactionary, on the other hand, is someone who doesn't accept the impacts of capitalist modernity, and he sees the immorality of capitalism, but instead of wanting to advance beyond it, he wants to roll back to former modes of production like feudalism because of relatively less moral evils. But the efficiency of capitalism has exploded any dream of going back to feudalism, and feudalism contains within it the material basis out of which capitalism arises. So, like Wang Ming says that we are reactionary because we endorse Stalin's conservatism. I really wonder how exactly we are reactionary, because when we believe in historical materialism and historical progress, even though that's not a deterministic linear progress, we do accept that capitalist modernity has had an impact. And even though we will say feudalism's not as bad as capitalism, we still think we should advance onto socialism and communism. I don't know how you can say reactionary. I think to some people, they just equate the word reactionary with discipline or order or something like that, but that's not what the word means. A bit like fascism, people just throw it around as an insult to populist movements, mass movements that they don't like because they see them gaining traction, but they don't know what the word actually means when they use it. Now, I credit the Premier with a lot of this because he actually mentioned it in the Discord server when he responded to the comments given by Wang Ming, but I will reiterate what he said here because I thought it was just brilliant and you could all really do with hearing it. So he said that scientific socialism is a systematic application of the abstraction of sociality to society. The abstraction was made by Marx because capitalist alienation created a soulless society with the unique property of destroying all social bonds and common good in society for the sake of the capitalist abstraction of profit, which is derived from the exploitation of a worker through the expropriation of value by the capitalist. So this is the idea that socialism arises out of capitalism, and before before capitalism, socialism isn't really something that needs to be explicitly thought about, but capitalism contains within it the basis out of which socialism comes. That's why we don't say that, capitalism is bad or as such, because we think it's necessary. Socialism can't come from feudalism, but certainly capitalism does a lot more moral evil than feudalism, but the solution is to advance onto socialism. And that's what the scientific socialist method that Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin and Mao gave to us can help us to achieve. So, much like you could say the ancient heresies of the church, you didn't explicitly need to condemn them or clarify the doctrine which was true until the heresy arose. So, in a similar way, socialism only needed to be developed when the sociality that was inherent in the previous civilizations prior to capitalism, which alienated man from it, was suddenly eroded by capitalism. Thus, the development of the theory of socialism was a historical necessity. And this is why that someone like Has says, for example, that feudalism is closer to socialism, and indeed morally it is, but there is no going back to it after the impact of capitalism. That's our point. There's a reason that capitalism arose. There's a reason that we don't live in pure capitalism now. We live in sort of a socialism for the rich, which is a planned economy, but for oligarchs and the minority of a few. There's a reason that the pure capitalism is gone, and within capitalism contains the internal contradictions, which is the reason that socialism arises. So you can't put the gear into reverse and try and go back to formal modes of production, because then if we restore feudalism, capitalism will come from it. So you can think it's the same with the church. When a dogma is defined, as Catholics we say that nothing new is invented, but a clarification is made of what has always been there in the deposit of faith, and was, before it was being challenged and undermined by a heresy, taken for granted by the faithful, consciously or unconsciously. In a similar way then, Marx's theory developed as a result of quite a similar process, but in history instead. So he did not invent anything new, but he developed a science capable of addressing the social question, that is to say, the unique inhumanity of capitalism, and through systematic science allows the proletariat to struggle for and regain their lost social commons. And not only does Marxism allow us to restore the socialist character of society that has been lost, but now that we have an explicit understanding of how this phenomenon works, it allows us to improve society consciously through comprehensive, systematic, and conscious socialization. So with this knowledge, economic enterprises can be socialized, whereby they are owned by the workers and managed for the common good. Housing can be socialized, whereby it is allocated based on social consensus, based upon the criteria of the common good again. Healthcare can be socialized for the common benefit, based upon the workers' consensus, the state, etc., etc. And we can do this consciously now that we are aware of the workings of the system. What was once a spontaneous phenomenon arising from the intrinsic laws of history can now be consciously utilized for the good of society in a way never before possible before we had this explicit knowledge given to us by Marx. People don't get this. They just have this idea of like a linear boundless progress until every norm and all order is eroded. And if you're not for abolishing everything, if you don't want to abolish the family, if you don't want to abolish marriage, if you don't want to abolish gender, if you don't want to just abolish discipline and order and just be in an orgy all the time and no restraint, and all the children just get thrown into town square and everyone has to raise them, no one knows who their family is. If you're not for that, then you're said to be a reactionary. You could be the most staunch advocates of the rights of a working class. You could be thoroughly against the exploitation through wage labour and thoroughly against the immorality of capitalism. But if you don't believe in this sort of linear, boundless progress until we all just become grey goo with no limits and everything that was once intolerable to us is now accepted, if you don't believe that, then they say you are a reactionary. Well, Wang Ming thought this as well. You can see it in his comments, that because he thinks Mao was against racism and treated women well, Well, he extrapolated and said, well, if Mao was alive today, he would, oh yeah, totally be for gay marriage and transgenderism. The only reason he opposed it is because of his time. Well, that's not the case. Things like, the emancipation of slaves and women's suffrage arise for determinate reasons. Things like racial subjugation or imperialism ought to be abolished, I agree, but eradicating these things does not mean necessarily embracing things like homosexuality or transgenderism or pedophilia, as they are clearly contrary to the natural law, whereas, giving women a vote and letting slaves be free obviously is not. So there is a standard to this, there is a limit to it, and the limit is our material humanity. I think Has put it well when in his conservative communism video. He took a bit of a teleological view. He said progress must have an end goal. You have to have an idea in mind of what you want to create. So a lot of these people want to tear down until there's nothing left, but they have no concept of the order that they want to put in, and a lot of times they don't want to put an order in. All they want to focus on is negative things, so like the destruction of marriage, the destruction of a family, the destruction of gender, but they have no idea of an end goal. So it's like, if progress has an end goal, then not everything need be abolished, only some things. So yes, we can see that in our end goal of society, yes, we're not going to have slaves, so let's go ahead and abolish slavery. But then in our end goal of society, what would be the need to abolish marriage? So progress is not just some sort of line in its linear relationship, like as time goes on, progress just gets more and more and more and more and more, and there's just like no end to this. So no, that's not the case. It's not just this unending nebulous linear path, and it's just this line going up and it goes on forever, just a straight directly proportional line. That's not how it works. There is an upper limit to this. Our material humanity has said this, and I think it's great. Progress cannot be infinite when our material being, our material humanity is itself finite. Communists must remember that it is not order that we're against, but exploitation. There is nothing redeemable about leftists. We should not be looking to leftists to try and recruit, or we should not step on eggshells around them. We should not try and change our language to appeal to them and not annoy them. Yeah, I don't care if we annoy leftists. Leftists are not the hope. The hope, like Has said at the CPI conference, is for people who are either apolitical now, or even more so, people who are currently right-wing, working class right-wing, people who voted for Trump, people who have trucks, people who have families, working class families. And we saw with the Trump election, well, that's these sorts of conservative working class people are at least half of the population of the United States. So communists are not against individuality, we're not against order, we're not against discipline, we're not against the family, we're not against marriage, we're not against gender. What we are against is exploitation, and for things that are exploitative, let's abolish them. But for things that are not exploitative, we don't need to say there's this hidden web of personal, hidden web of secret, invisible exploitation, where every norm and every standard and every discipline is actually a way of a patriarchy, and it's a way to invisibly exploit people. Because when you ask these people, well, is it a political exploitation? Is the state doing it? It's like, oh no, it's a cultural exploitation, and so we have to tear down every boundary and standard that our society has ever had. And it's like, well, this is the idea of the counterculture and the new left, which is what came in after McCarthyism had ripped out the old left and like your old CPUSA, genuine Marxist-Leninists who were tied to the Soviet Union. These sort of counterculture idea is what came in its place, like, and it presented much less of a threat to the ruling class because it was primarily focused on culture wars, and the bourgeoisie didn't care if they were tearing marriages apart and such things, so long as they didn't come after their class interests. And you see the socialist states of the world, they drew their lines here, and they did not let the American counterculture in. They banned things like denim and rock and roll and jazz music and this kind of thing, because they didn't like this rebellious spirit that wanted to get rid of all their norms. They said, well, even though we can't, we might not necessarily have falsifiable Even though we might not have certainty about these things, we can say things like marriage and gender roles and that kind of thing aren't necessarily exploitative, and they can be beneficial for society. And that this idea that not every form of science must be an empirically falsifiable science, and not everything has to be falsifiable for it to have value. You might not have a determinate certainty about a certain thing, but it doesn't mean that it's not a reality. Science, we need to know what science is, and I've said this before on this channel, that science is simply a knowledge of a thing through its causes. There exists philosophical science, social science, political science. And we need to be especially aware of this as Marxists, because we do not operate within an empirical science ourselves. But even something like mathematics is not based upon empirical observation. You can't put an integral under a microscope, but from the things you can observe, you can extract on that basis and apply deductive reasoning, and hence come to a science of quantities. So, as to these things that we see in our society that have no empirical explanation, but are what we say are written onto the hearts of men, and consistently arise in differing and isolated civilizations, well, this is what the socialist state said. They said that there's no need to throw them out simply because they are not falsifiable. They can still be of value to us, so long as they're not exploitative. So things like the desire for man to preserve his own life and other innocent life, the desire to procreate and continue the species, the desire to pursue knowledge and educate children, the wish for an orderly and harmonious society, and if you're religious, the common desire seen to worship God. And there's good anthropological evidence for different peoples trying to do things like make sacrifices to atone for guilt, or to investigate what happens after death in various cultures and civilizations up and down the millennia. But that's not the point. The point is, because the empiricist can never just accept that these things are realities that we interact with, because they're not physical, he has to come up with purely naturalistic explanations like Freud's Oedipus complex and wish fulfillment, often to perverse results. So that one deals specifically with this guilt that we all feel, and why people want to make sacrifices to a father figure to atone for this guilt. And he makes this whole perverse story up about some primordial father that a son killed, and then because he wanted to breed with a mother, and then he made like a totem father, and he called that God the Father, and made sacrifices to him because he felt guilty for killing his dad, and then somehow that becomes ingrained in the conscience of all men, like biologically or something, and that's why we see this commonly arising. I guess you'd have to do that for all of his desires, so you'd have to account for why he wants to procreate and continue the species, why he wants to educate children and gain knowledge, why he wants order and harmonious society, and he accounts for the God one. But why can't you just accept that these things, even though that we can't put them under the microscope, they are real things that exist for humanity, and they're not just the result of chemical reactions in the brain? Why can't you just accept that? That's sort of the Anglo-empiricism that we're dealing with, and that's what's rooted in this counterculture destruction of everything that isn't obvious and isn't physical. Every standard, every norm, every boundary, every limit, all the order. And that is where communists draw a line and say, no, we're not part of this counterculture. And those who join the counterculture, well, they're traitors to communism. Perhaps we should accept that there is a common symptom that we can't have certainty about, but nevertheless exists. Material humanity. That's what we can call it. And so we ought not to be dogmatic about these things and only see the value in religion, family, marriage, culture and traditions merely from a sociological perspective, but maybe, shocking idea, we could actually consider their claims as being true and say, look, this is a reality, and even though we can't physically see it, we're going to look at the philosophical arguments around this, and we're going to accept this as being part of our material humanity. So these things like gender norms, cultural traditions, cultural aesthetics, traditional foods, clothing, ceremonies, music, we don't just have to throw it all out and say it's contrary to socialism. We can imbue all these things with a proletarian character, and taking away from the corruption of worldly interests and capital, we can allow people to have a more authentic interaction with their material humanity. And that is the idea of conservative communism. We don't want to destroy all of these traditional things that people hold dear. We want to separate it from the corrupting influences that is come under what is secular capitalism, that doesn't really have regard for tradition or regard for family or anything like that, and only wanted to use these traditional things, these religious things, these cultural things to their own ends of gaining more profits. Well, what we want to do is separate it from all of those influences and thus allow people to have an unaffected relationship with these parts of our humanity, and thus communism will allow for a more authentic discovery, more authentic interaction with these things that capitalism has hijacked. So we don't want to destroy them, we just want to rid them of capitalist influence so people can appreciate them for what they truly are, and on a deeper level than just being some cynical tool for a capitalist or for a nation state. So like Has says, remember, feudalism and socialism are actually related, and although capitalist modernity changes everything and trying to clone the pre-capitalist society in a reactionary way is an action destined to fail, socially though, feudalism is far more similar to what we would want than the present state of affairs in capitalism. The difference is feudalism still had economic exploitation, whereas our socialist society won't, but morally and spiritually will be a lot closer to feudalism than capitalism, which is just soulless and nihilistic. Scientific socialism then addresses how we can restore this social feature, this abstraction of sociality that was present in former modes of production within modernity, which before capitalism, it was just previously intuitively understood, so it needed not to be explicitly stated until its removal with capitalism. And then Marx saw that, he saw the alienation, he saw the nihilism of capitalism, he saw how it divorced us from our humanity, and he explained it in explicit detail, which we can now use as a tool to construct positively. So thank you all for watching all the way through, and I hope it helped to clarify on our last video. And I hope, Wang Ming, you can have a better understanding of things now, and frankly leave our comments section alone unless you have something nice to say. But until next time, comrades, thanks for sticking around so long, and farewell.
雄心在，不负人民养育情。战友啊战友，亲爱的弟兄，待到春风传家训。我们再相逢，再相逢。起来，起帆教我的。起来，全世界受苦的人！